Welcome back to the podcast. Today I've got one of the leading experts in Autodesk and Revit, and you guys are going to love this. I've got Jeffy McGrew with us. He comes from a background of some extreme architecture, knowing all the processes, the back of the house, how the systems all work. You're going to have fun listening to this one. We're really going to dive deep into Revit and some of the things, the promises that they are, and where they kind of what we've always been looking for, and kind of where they're not making it. So get excited to listen to this one. Jeffrey, welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me on.
We talk a lot about Revit, and I want Revit to be this promise, right? I've been looking for the promised land. I've been looking for Revit to really drive us down and take all of that stuff, that pre-construction work, and bring it to the surface. And it's been difficult to get that out of Revit.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting you say promise, because that promise of what Revit is has shifted over the years. Because I was a really early adopter, started using Revit with version 3.1 back in like 2000. Started one of the very first Revit users group in America, the one got to become friends with a lot of the developers that were actually making Revit. This is all pre-Autodesk buyout, Back then, it was really when Revit first started. I mean, the idea of BIM was there certainly in the idea of Revit, but it was kind of more about like, here's a tool that will help you draw things faster, right? Like, here's a tool that'll help you produce document sets easier. And the ironic thing is, when Revit first came out, everybody was like, well, this looks great for design, but when it comes to construction documents, we're still going to use AutoCAD, or it doesn't look like it's good enough for doing construction documents, which I feel is ironic, because now in the industry, it's the opposite, where everybody's like, oh, Revit's great for construction documents, but we're going to use Rhino for design, or we're going to use SketchUp for design. We're going to use something else, right, for the design on the design side. So, but yeah, the initial promise behind Revit was basically like, here is an application that is going to help save you, the construction professional, time by being something that's custom tailored for your kind of workflow and your kind of jobs, and it was built upon foundations that came from the mechanical CAD world, right? Because the original main founders all came from like PTC Technologies, who made Pro Engineer, which is a SolidWorks 3D modeling platform for mechanical engineering. And but then here we are, 24 years later, roughly. And it's been really interesting to see how things have played out. Like, that initial promise that I thought from Revit, some parts very much came true, and some parts, like you were just saying, very much didn't come true, in terms of it being this kind of holistic platform that we could all be working on in a really intelligent 3D BIM, kind of way. Right. And And so my company, BWC Architects, because we've leveraged Revit really heavily into digital fabrication, into modeling everything. Because we're design build, we're kind of more vertically integrated, where we're able to do that sort of thing without having to worry about contractual issues and other stuff. But at the same time, we've been using kind of Revit to its fullest over the last 24 years or so. I kind of assumed everybody would, right? But then when I look at the industry, it's like, oh, actually, we are a very small minority of people that are actually modeling things to a fabrication level of detail, or to like really primarily coordinating in the Revit model, working primarily as a model-centric sort of workflow. And the rest of the industry pretty much mostly used Revit as like a better drafting tool, right? Like a better drawing tool, which is fine. It's one of those things where it's like, oh, it's been an interesting divergence to see,
Well,
So.
what do you think causes that? Is it just because making the models, making the individual components is so labor intensive up until now? It's just been too much weight on the architect to really go in and make those individual components?
No, actually, because that was one of the big differentiators between like Revit and some of the other systems like Allplan or ArchiCAD or some of the other ones, where like back in the day, ArchiCAD, you had to actually code the components. You had to write code. It was GDL code. And in Revit, you could just model the thing that you wanted, right? So it was a huge difference. And I totally saw lots of users pick up and be able to make like basic content for Revit without a whole lot of trouble. I think the bigger issue really has to do with, at least my take on it, is that there was a real break that happened in our industry, because a lot of the senior leadership never learned CAD or learned a little bit of CAD, but was still primarily like very drawing centric, coming out of
Yeah.
the 80s, 90s, is very drawing centric. And then all of a sudden now you have this model centric workflow coming in with Revit. And, there was already a disconnect where the leadership of the firm didn't understand what was going on with the CAD. And they were just marking things up as red lines and handing them back to junior draftspeople who did understand what was going on with the CAD. And then you go from AutoCAD to like Revit to like BIM, that problem got even worse. So back in like 2005, 2007, I was Gensler's firm-wide Revit expert. So I was their first like Revit specific hire to help translate the whole company, all 4 or 5,000 people at the time, to start utilizing Revit. Not exclusively, but like, okay, we're moving this direction. We want to roll Revit out. We have some big projects that are using it. And I remember a lot of problems where, like a senior associate would be like, I'm looking at the drawing set and this drawing set looks like it's incomplete. What have you guys been doing for the last month? And the team being like, no, we've been modeling for the last month and the model's actually very complete. And we're going to start making more documentation. But just because we don't have like wall sections drawn yet doesn't mean that the project hasn't been thought through and that we're like actually much further along than you think. And so there was such a break. And so there was a lot of people that I think were so drawing centric and trained on a 2D workflow that they just either brought that with them over into Revit. And they're like, okay, I'm just going to use Revit like a fancier AutoCAD, right? Like I've seen projects that we've gotten from other people where we were brought in to do like a fancy ceiling in a commercial office space where, and this is like the other brand that we have, Secret Weapon Workshop, where an existing architecture firm hired us to help figure out this more complex part of a project, right? So this other architecture firm is doing the TI and they're building out the space, but they have the client and them have this crazy idea for this like faceted metal folded ceiling thing. And we're like, oh, we can totally help you figure that out. And we fabricate it, we deliver it, we had a team install it, like all that kind of jazz. But in that project, when we get their initial Revit model from them, because they're working in Revit, it's mostly 2D elements and lines on the ground with some 3D stuff, and the drawing set looks perfectly fine. And they got their permit and they're building this out as a TI thing. And they're productive enough working that way, but they're really not modeling very much, And so it was at that point, this was years ago, but it was a real culture shock moment for me because I just assumed, oh, they're working in Revit. We'll get their Revit model. We'll be able to work inside of that. Everything will be great. It's like, oh, actually, no, their Revit model is really incomplete. But again, like, I don't mean that as a criticism, right? It's like, oh, their workflow of having this incomplete 3D Revit model was perfectly valid because it's possible that it made them more productive in just cranking out 2D TI sets, right? Where like, we're not going to take the time to model everything in the project because we don't care, right? Whereas we're like custom fabricating stuff. So we're like, oh, we do care. So we have to model all of the existing conditions because our stuff has to work around that. You know what I mean?
No, no,
So
I mean,
yeah, yeah,
with the weight of modeling, I think, my judgments,
yeah.
that's what slowed it down. And you're right. Everything I've seen in Revit up until now has really been, really just 2D drawings. And now,
Mhm.
have you seen anything yet where AI is actually doing the modeling for us, where it's taking some of that weight and doing the modeling? Because my judgment is that somewhere here,
Mhm.
we're going to make this shift where AI will be able to handle a lot of the weight of the modeling.
I've seen some really interesting developments where people have been using not exactly AI. I mean, I'm sure there's a little bit of AI in there, but not in the kind of current, large language model craze, generative prompting
Yeah,
sort of
yeah.
space. But instead, I've seen some interesting like scan to BIM stuff for existing conditions, right? Where it's like you do a laser scan, you do a point cloud, and then it uses fairly intelligent ways to kind of semi-automatically turn the point cloud into an actual semantically correct Revit model, to where here's a wall, here's a door, I know what the door is, so I'm going to put a door there and make it a door family. So at least when I come around to do my work, I could swap that for the bright door or what have you. So I've seen some work on that side, which I think is really exciting because we mostly do renovative work. So it's, anything that speeds that process up for us is going to be great. Um, in terms of like, I have a chair and my client wants to see the specific chair in the design, right? And nobody's made a Revit family of this chair. That I don't know. Like I haven't seen a lot of work there because all the generative stuff that I've been seeing in the 3D space around original content, like I'm going to show you some pictures and you're going to make a model, or I'm going to describe something and you're going to make a model. All of it is all just producing meshes of one kind or another, you
Yeah,
know?
for me,
So,
in order for it to be really productive in the,
mhm,
going forward, without having the component breakdown of the families, it ends
mhm,
up not doing much value, other than, now I've got to start on it, but I ultimately need, in order to really create the next part, to either to extrude something or to be able to buy something or to be able
mhm,
to design,
yeah,
really
yeah,
have it be effective. I need that other component to make that,
mhm,
and that's always been what's missing in the industry, right? You know Now we're going to leave it to the field to go and design those components, right? We'll get
right,
you close, we'll get you up there close,
right.
but now you in the field go and you'll
Well,
ultimately make a shop drawing that will get you close.
yeah, and I think you bring up a really interesting point in that one of the ways that I've seen prefab companies that are trying to do prefabricated construction fail is just in the fact that like in because I also fairly recently ran a furniture company that was a startup where we teamed up with some other people. It was like VC backed, a thing where we're 3D printing furniture. So I learned a ton about manufacturing. I got way more into that world. And when you're manufacturing something, you plan everything out as much as you can, right?
Right.
Yeah. Down to every detail. In construction, you don't, because there's a lot of stuff where, like you were just saying, at the face of work, the drywall team is going to know more about laying out the drywall than any of the design team up to that person. So, if you're not bringing that design, if you're not bringing the drywall team in on the design side, then you're expecting for them to just figure out certain things. Like most projects, even super detailed BIM projects that were modeled in Revit down to quote unquote the last detail, a lot of electrical, anything below like a half-inch conduit size, they don't model
That's
because
right.
they're like, well, the electricians are experts at this. They'll bend the conduit and it will all meet code. And we don't have to think about all the very minute little code things when it comes to like how the conduit is supposed to work. We're only going to worry about the really big conduit that you can't just bend on site to fit, right? So I think there's a certain interesting thing where you just said on the planning side, where in the construction industry, for a variety of reasons, there's a lot of work that's figured out by the trades, whether that's through shop drawings or even just in the field, that isn't, part of the design process at all.
Well,
Um,
and I
you know,
think that really becomes the mess. I mean,
yeah,
ultimately, that's the mess that I believe that becomes the environmental nightmare. It becomes the waste of
yeah,
time. It becomes the industry. Why the everybody's so frustrated with the industry is,
hmm
you know, and because the work up front to make the model was so heavy. And I get it. Look, I get it.
yeah,
You're still into design development. You're just trying to get to a permit. You're trying to get,
hmm
but
yeah,
my judgment is as we solve that weight that's caused in the beginning, where for example, you know every stick of wood, every 2x4, every
hmm
4x8, every sheet that goes out there, every pound, every gallon of mud that we use, at some point I believe that what really will make the industry change, the dramatic change that we're looking for, if we really want to take construction to where we're building, I've got this sign on the other side of this wall. It says "dirt to dishes in 4 weeks." Right? I mean, we're starting to build
hmm
ground up buildings much faster, way smarter. The real push has got to be to where we're down to the nth degree in the design development, which then creates,
right,
really ultimately, I think ultimately creates these scopes that become easier. The schedules that become 15-minute increments. Now, to sit here today and think that way, it's impossible. Like
yeah,
here, I
yeah,
tell people we're gonna do schedules down to 15-minute increments. It literally blows people's mind. Like, dude, that's annoying.
yeah.
You
Yeah.
know,
Well, and also I think it's untenable for a few reasons. I mean, one is the tools, right? Like you couldn't do 15-minute schedules in Revit, right? Like it just wouldn't work. You'd have to have like a million phases and it just wouldn't work anymore, right? Because it was never built with that kind of thought in mind, right? And there's a lot of stuff in Revit where it's like, okay, I can't model certain things that I need to be able to model in Revit. Hence why, like at our company, we also use Fusion. These days, we're using a lot of Fusion for certain fabrication level things because we can't model those things in Revit very effectively. So we have to, do design placeholders in Revit, and then the actual fabrication model is living in some other system somewhere else, right?
Right.
Instead of being able to just do
Killer.
everything in Revit. Right.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, you have to be really careful about how you manage that because you can introduce a ton of problems, and
Yep.
and then you have to back coordinate stuff and other things, and it's terrible. But then also, on the flip side, on like the on the economic and cultural side of things, I could sit down and plan out every single detail on this house remodel to the level that you were just talking about, right? But the client isn't going to pay for all that time, like they're going to
Right.
pay me to like get the permit and do a halfway decent drawing set for this house that they want, a remodel on, but they're not going to pay like an extra month's worth of my time for me to plan out like where every conduit's going to go or anything. Even though it could save some time downstream, it's not going to save enough of the cost of the construction project because it's just a one-off house. Like if you're doing a subdivision where you're repeating over and over, totally makes sense. So I think there's also an economic problem where it doesn't make sense to plan all this stuff out, and it does actually make economic sense, at least, to just kick it to like, okay, the electrician's just going to figure this out, and I'm not going to, I'm going to make sure it's plausible, like it's a workable idea. I'm not going to put something in there where it's like impossible, but at the same time, like I'm not going to worry about the specifics of some of this stuff.
So
Yeah.
if this is the lifespan of a building, right? Let's call
Mhm.
that, I don't know, let's call it 50 years, right? Let's
Mhm.
call it 50, right? The part that touches my fingers, construction. People will
Mhm.
put up with a lot of drama because of the interaction with construction is so limited.
Yeah.
But what we're finding out right now is the biggest environmental nightmare that we're having, and this is something we don't talk about, the effect of of what happens because we don't pay the architect. Now, look, I get it. Even
Mhm.
at the level I'm talking about, I don't think you could get architects at this point to do that without having some technology that carries most of the weight. Because even if
Mhm.
I gave you 6 months to do 6 months more than you wanted, and I gave you 6 times the fee, the level of detail it would take to get really, really effective is going to be
Mhm.
it's going to be so much more dramatic than anybody's ever used to. It'll
Mhm.
be a mindset change. But let's just imagine for a second. Here's a world where imagine in the second that a brand that sells hamburgers right around the world with big giant letter M on them. Imagine that brand says, "All right, I'm going to build 100 new stores." They're looking at doing 200 stores
Mhm.
a year for the next 5 years, 1,000 stores they want to build.
Mhm.
Imagine in the moment they decide to do that, that an AI model can go out and search the marketplaces and find a demographic model that can find them the locations way faster than ever before, right?
Mhm.
And at a 10,000x demographic model that's way more efficient and ensures a much higher level of success probability than ever before. But imagine in that same moment they're able to take the database of blockchain information about that piece of property and in the moment be able to take their prototype and site adapt it to that property, right?
Mhm.
In a model and be able to design it and then order all the material and then go to the marketplace and find all the labor and schedule it in the most efficient way. Now, look, where the world's going today, if you look at our construction projects, here's how that happens. We have somebody goes out, looks at a property, they say for rent on it, they go back and forth about this property for a year and a
Yeah.
half
Yeah.
with a broker, back and forth, this really waste of time. And then architects get it. You guys get to go, all right, great, here, we're going to pay you half what you really deserve, but I need them out in 30 days. And now we're trying to
Mhm.
squeeze out a prototype on a site adapt, much more difficult. Now we do that. We run through permit, and then we have
Yeah.
5 companies bid it. Let's call it, five.
Yeah.
For me, we're a GC company. We bid. Imagine there's 50 line items, and we bid three subs per line item because we want to win the bid. Now that's
Mhm.
150 different teams of people for us that are
Right.
bidding. Now at $1,000
Right.
a piece, that's $150,000 that the industry sucks out of the industry, and no one's won a project. Now we got 5 companies doing it. That's
Mhm.
$750,000 in pre-construction cost that the
Yeah.
industry sucks out of it. Now we got to, one says I could do it for 10, one says I could do it for 9, one says I could do it for 8. Now, we got to go with the low bidder who now we have to work with that guy who's probably, or that person who's not effective. And the
Mhm.
domino effect of then we bring in these trades that are you know,
Yeah.
really ineffective. Look, 10% of all material brought to a job site ends up in a dumpster. If
Oh, probably more than 10.
right,
There was
right,
a
right, right.
famous, what was it? There's a famous, a quote that I overheard from a friend once where somebody who runs one of the really big, like, home building companies that builds, like, whole subdivisions said it. They said something like, we build, God, what was it? It was really pithy. It was like, basically, we build 5 houses and we throw the sixth one in the trash. is,
Right,
is
you're
the
like,
way that they
ah,
put it.
right, right,
Yeah.
right, right. Think about that.
Yeah.
We do. So I think there's where the story we've got to stand on saying, look,
Hmm.
the promise I've always had with Revit was that we can make these components way smarter. If it's
Yeah.
being
Yeah.
able to, material source and design and cut before we ever get there. If
Hmm.
it's,
Hmm.
look, I'm not sure that I can
Yeah.
solve all. I can't even see it from where I stand yet today, but just knowing that our inefficiencies up until now, we've got to drive that next level of efficiency. And the
Hmm.
promise that we always had for me was always about having Revit being able to, be able to pick from materials. I mean, ultimately pick from materials from around the world.
Yeah.
And then my thought would always be that, look, if we could get an AI model that could API into the marketplace and go, all right, what's available? Right? They can
Hmm.
find the best source materials that fit a schedule and a budget all simultaneously. So we skip that whole dance that we do. I mean, the inefficiencies of going back and forth because of budget. Well, we designed it this way. Now we can't afford to do that, or the material's not available. It's,
Yeah.
coming from Ethiopia and I can't get that chair or this piece or that product or this tubing, whatever it is that makes the
Hmm.
inefficiency. Right. I mean, we
Yeah.
suffer in our business because of that. Imagine being able to do that at design.
Yeah, it was always, I mean, I'm surprised. I always thought that, like, in the early days of Revit, there were, ideas around, like, how Revit could be used for, like, quantity takeoff, could be used for, like, construction cost estimation and that sort of stuff. And I mean, it was able to be used to some extent within that space. But then it never really, for whatever reason, it never really grew beyond just like, I'm going to kind of make a database that I'm like looking up values in. And that was kind of it, right? There's not a lot of like automated tools that will tell me like, oh, you know, your wall heights are such that you're going to need to order 10-foot sheets of drywall, not 8-foot sheets of drywall, and that's going to raise your cost like X number of dollars, and I see the same thing. It's interesting because I see the same semantic problems on the mechanical engineering side too, where I can easily model something in Fusion that is made from an aluminum alloy and use the sheet metal tool set, which understands how to unfold things, right? So these are going to be a folded assembly. It's going to be made on a CNC press brake. I say it's made out of a certain aluminum that would totally crack at that thickness. And if you folded it, and Fusion is more than happy to be like, oh, I'll model this all up, even though theoretically this is, I'll model this all up to where it's theoretically perfect, but when you actually go to utilize it, it's going to fail because, I don't have, because Fusion doesn't have any smarts built into it in terms of like that material won't be performative in this kind of application. You know what I mean? And Revit doesn't really either, right? So just to talk about like not only cost but also like the semantics around like how a particular material is going to perform haven't really been fully embraced either. I am seeing some interesting new trends, but unfortunately for me, a lot of what I've been seeing with like Forma, which Autodesk is their new thing that they're touting, and Snaptrude and a bunch of the other like kind of newer BIM platforms that are kind of in their startup phase, everybody seems to be focusing on ground up construction and early phase design, which that's great, but that has no relevance to me at all.
Right.
Like we're primarily renovative work, and early design isn't my problem. You know what I mean? Like early design, we don't have a problem with early design. We're able to crank out early design, no problems. We're able to do that really effectively and fast. Where I'm getting bogged down, especially on the Revit side, is on the documentation, right? Like having to do a lot of redundant, like the way that I put it is that because the building department doesn't trust us, the build team,
Okay.
and because we don't trust the contractor 100% in a traditional, architect contractor kind of relationship, we have to over detail all of this stuff in our design set. So I figure there's only about a third of my document set that is actually design intent, in terms of this is what we need to build. The other third is to make the building department happy, and another third is to make sure that the contractor isn't going to do something stupid. And so the case in point is like a grab bar, right? So grab bar in a bathroom that's an accessible restroom, right? You would really have to try hard to find a grab bar that you could buy off the shelf that doesn't meet code, right? Like
Right.
you know,
Sure.
you go to Home Depot, you pick up a grab bar, it's gonna
Right.
be a code hand bar, right? But I still have to detail what the radius of it is and the offset from the wall and like all this other stuff so that the building department knows that we're not going to just screw something to the wall at random. And I have to also do that to make sure that the contractor isn't just going to screw something to the wall at random. Even though the contractor, you know, if we're working with a competent contractor and because we're design building, because we're small, we only work with, you know, contractors that we've worked with before that we're sure are going to be able to really deliver on the job. They've built dozens of bathrooms. Like they don't even have to look at our drawing set and build, and they'll be able to build an accessible bathroom. You know what I mean? So again, there's all of this waste that we have built into the process because of all of this, you know. It's, yeah, it gets painful. So I have seen some interesting stuff on the mechanical engineering side in terms of automating documentation for shop drawings and stuff. Fusion has a new tool set that they added that's fantastic for being able to like do 80% of your shop drawing for you, and you just come in and add like a little bit more detail and dimensions as needed, and then it's done. Like it's brilliant. I've seen a little bit of that happening on the BIM side too. There's a few startups that are trying to like automate documentation out of Revit or out of other models, but other than like PyRevit or you know, some stuff that I've seen people do in Dynamo to try to automate documentation outside of Revit, it's still really painful. You know, where you're going to be spending a lot of time just like placing tags, moving tags so they don't overlap. You know, placing dimensions, placing nodes, placing keynotes, like making lots of redundant views of things to explain what they are, even though you have it fully modeled, you know, and ready to go in the model. Yeah.
Well, the problem becomes then each group does the tagging differently. You know, we're trying to
Yeah.
find software now that can read plans for our to do takeoffs for our estimating team,
Yeah.
right? There's the human condition of having us go in and do, you know, we use Bluebeam and go in and do takeoffs. It's really time consuming. You're right. We have a great risk because we're doing this for projects we may or may not get.
Right.
And then, you know, then we create these scopes based off of our takeoffs, right? Which my real judgment, that should happen at design, right? I mean, like you said, why isn't Revit kicking out a square foot unit pricing breakdown at design? I mean, why is that not, you know, we leave a tile takeoff to the guy in the field, right? We got a tile guy who comes out and goes, all right, or somebody, or an estimator in the office. And,
Yep.
you know, they don't realize that.
And the tile, yeah, and the tile guy is going to order like 30% more boxes, 20% more boxes because of breakage and other stuff, right? Yeah, so you wind up with all this extra stuff, and yeah,
he's not connected to the pricing or the environment, nor does he care. He just doesn't want to have to come back, right? He wants to be able to get in and get out. So he's ordered his convenience, and now we're looking at this going, hey, look, there's that fifth house or sixth house that we just threw away. You know, on every group of, on every block that we build, we're throwing a house away. You know, that happens every day, millions of times a day, all around the world. And, you know, there's where the story's got to be told. And I'm like, look, Revit, look, this is your chance to take over and dominate in a place where if we could just take that next step, right? The whole goal is to be able to get to, you know, that 3D model, right? One, now the next part is AI will be the source for material purchasing later on, right? As we go into design, my judgment is that, you know, AI will be where people will be how they buy materials for their construction projects, right? People do takeoffs, they'll be able to get that, but AI won't be able to pick the product if it doesn't have a digital footprint. You know, I just did a podcast with the Canadian Lumber Association, and they're currently putting in a chip into every piece of wood that comes out of Canada. Right? Imagine they'll have how dry it is, its transportation. They'll need to travel. They'll be able to track that piece of lumber. You'll be able to scan a pile of lumber, and you'll know how many 2x4s are in that pile, right? You know, that process. They're forward thinking. I'm like, bravo to you guys. You're really, from the tree it starts at the tree, and all the way from there, all the way through the production line, all the way through to you know, to its end, you know, its end result. And you know what my judgment is, they'll be able, you know, the AI model will be able to pick and trust, because not only that, as it gets smarter at picking materials, and understand availability for schedules, right? Because as it designs, it'll also want to find cost and availability that meets schedules, right? Having that digital footprint will have it see it clearer, right? It'll be able to trust the material. It'll be able to trust that it'll meet the schedule because they've tracked it and they've proven it's already been proved out that their delivery process
Yeah.
works.
I don't know if you need AI for any of that though, because honestly, right now there's sections of the steel fabrication world that work exactly like that, right? Like there's shops where it's like everything was modeled in Tekla, everything was made by CNC machines in a giant facility that cut all the beams and coped them and put the holes where they were needed to go. Everything was labeled and barcoded and shipped to the site, and cranes into place and just bolts together, and they're tracking it using feedback from site tools where they're surveying stuff and coming back to the Tekla model to be like, oh, here's what's installed and here's what's delivered. And people have been doing that for quite a while. So I don't know if it's necessarily AI. I think the bigger problem for more people to adopt that kind of workflow is kind of a cultural and political change, because people ask us, friends of mine that still work at like larger firms, would see our design build workflow, CNC enabled. We're just fabricating stuff straight off the model. And they'd be like, hey, Jeffrey, how can we work like this? And I'd be like, I have no idea. Like, I'm really sorry. But like, because of your contracts, because of your legal, way that you've removed, liability and tried to keep it at arm's reach, you're not able to embrace a lot of these digital tools to be able to work more effectively until you do that. So like on paper, being a design build firm, we have a lot more risk, right? Because we have a hand in the construction, we're much more likely to wind up in trouble because of it, right? Than a traditional architecture firm. The reality though, when you actually get down to it, is we have less risk because we have more control over the project. If something shows up on the job site and it's not right and the client's mad, we can just be like, you know what? Give us a week. New cabinets will show up next week.
Yeah.
That's it. No argument, no fighting, no trying to figure out who messed up, no people trying to sue each other. We can just solve the problem. Everybody makes money. Like the client's happy. Like it's actually fantastic, right? But again, like culturally, when you go to like, the traditional the AIA contracts and other things like that, they're all about removing liability and all about removing risk. And if you're a design only firm and you're not actually involved in the construction, then culturally there's also problems where the build team might not listen to you as much, right? Because we have a hand in the construction and we're physically delivering things to the site that then the contractor's installing or our crew's installing. For whatever reason, when we're at a meeting and I'm like, I think here's how we could solve this problem, everybody's, the construction team is more likely to listen to us about it, or we're more likely to listen to them because we're on the same side, right, in trying to get the project built and have everybody make money out of it, than in a traditional thing. So I don't know if necessarily AI is going to solve those specific problems, you know what I mean, around the kind of legal political side of things and the cultural side of things. I think you need to see firms like the steel industry, like HVAC is another great example, or the HVAC guys, where they're more vertically integrated and they're more design build, and they're able to, and because of that, they're able to embrace a lot more of this kind of technology and be, more productive because of it. Whereas like a traditional, architecture firm is going to have a much harder time doing that, I think,
No, that moving, transferring that risk has always been the thing. Like architects, like, hey, look, I'm not getting paid enough money to take the risk on. Move that down to the guys getting paid to put that in. We'll get you close to the design of it. And ultimately, I get it. I look, nobody wants to take on risk, and but what happens is all of us get dragged into court. If something fails or something doesn't happen properly, we all get dragged. They go after the whole team. And my whole want is to create buildings and designs. First of all, I think that architects, the weight of where we're going, the real gift of what's coming is that the weight of the weighted stuff that's really bogging us down and taking away the creativity, right? That doing shops and doing drawings and doing all that. all of that weight that's in there stops the creative part of the design, the architect. The architect who really can go and come up with the most fabulous ideas. The one that can really create environments that just move an entire community, right? A place where an architect really should be spent is really in creating that environment. Now, doing detailing out hand holds for ADA bathrooms,
Mhm.
it's just painful, right? To me, I look, I'm like, damn, come on, I want them to create a whole other way of looking at it that I haven't seen before.
It's an interesting point though that you're making, just in the fact that I'm not disagreeing with you, but just as a counter example, so to speak, I remember a really great lecture that I read. I didn't see the lecture, but there's this great book about Frank Gehry where it's all of like Frank Gehry's, it's his actual lectures and notes and like times that he spoke and everything like that, or people from his firm, right? So it's very pragmatic. It's not the architectural like aesthetic side. He talks a lot, and some of the people that work at his firm talk a lot about how they give up certain things to have other things out of the project, right? So like Frank Gehry's like, okay, we have the crazy outer skin, we've got all this like crazy stuff going on. We're not obsessing over light switch placement, right?
Okay. Right.
Like, where there's a lot of architects that are like spend way too much on details that nobody really cares about and would be obsessed over light switch placement, but are then missing out on the opportunity to do the bigger, more creative thing, more because of them than necessarily the tools limiting them, right? Like, I'm not limited because I have to detail a handrail in a bathroom. I just get it done quickly, and it's not holding me back. For me, the issue is always like, the budget. It's always like, what is the, what are we able to do here that's going to work best politically as well? Because, since we're doing renovative work, there's always an issue of like, okay, is the building code going to let us turn this space into the thing that we want to turn it into, right? Like, there's exiting, there's all this stuff, and that's part of the kind of craft, I feel like, on the architecture side, figuring out how to keep that idea intact through that whole process into construction and still winding up with a great project, at the end of it, is kind of the whole thing. So I feel like the thing where architects should just be focusing on the, like you were just saying, like the flow of the space and stuff like that. I feel like it's partially true, but one of the things that, since we're talking a lot about AI, that I'm really intrigued at is this idea that like all of these new BIM tools are all about early design or concept design, where I'm like, I see that as one of the areas that AI is going to disrupt more than a lot of the rest of the process, right? Because already we're using some AI tools to do concept stuff with our clients. I'm already seeing people more and more using AI, like primarily when I say AI, I mean large language model, like image generators,
Yep.
to do specific, things, where they have trained models to produce concepts of one kind or another. You know what I mean? Or you even got stuff that's like not exactly AI, but like AI adjacent, like Test Fit and some of these other startups that are like, okay, we're going to do these generative designed sort of things to like lay out buildings really quickly, lay out parking lots really quickly, and all that kind of stuff.
Look, I
Yeah.
think those are just like ChatGPT. Look, I'm not sending the letter from ChatGPT. Hey Chat, help me write a
Mm-hmm.
letter to somebody that's a difficult conversation to have. Whatever it is.
Mm-hmm.
Each of those designs, look, I want you to give me the ballpark, and from there, then carry some of the heavy weight of laying it out. Give me the distances, the clearances. Give me the,
Yeah.
some ideas. Here, give me 10 different ideas that give me a
Right.
portico shear that work to get two
Yep.
rows of cars through on this small piece of
And
property.
that's exactly how we're working with some of these tools. Is like we'll be working with a client, and the client's like, hey, I was thinking of this like Moroccan blue tile for the bathroom. I'll be like, oh, here's 10 different images of that, as an idea. And they'll be like, oh, I really like, I number 4 is what I had in mind, and then we're like, great, we'll take that number 4 and we'll make that real. You
Well,
know what I mean?
the problem
Like,
goes. Did you see the budget you gave me? It doesn't give you number 4. Number 4 doesn't match.
well, that's part of the conversation too.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. Be like, number 4 is what I have in mind. And we're like, okay, then, but because we're design build and we're more involved
Yeah.
in the construction
Yeah.
side, we can say like, okay, you can have number 4, but you're going to have to give up these other things over here.
Right. And
Exactly. Yeah.
I got a buddy of mine who does an event company. He goes, look, I don't know what's happened, but every one of my clients now walks in with this generated design. I'm like, they come in with this, beer pocket, and they want a champagne
Yeah.
design.
Yeah.
Like, look, yeah, you can get that, but that budget you give me, it's not going to get
Yeah.
to there.
Yeah. Well, the other thing that I always think of when I think of these like AI as a design tool, AI as an image generator, is this is a little bit of a obtuse example, but just bear with me for a second. Way back when Mozart, the composer, and other musicians of that era, like 1800s, 1700s, it became like a little thing where by rolling dice, there was a game that you could generate a waltz, right? You roll dice, you follow the rules, it writes a waltz, right? So, and it was just kind of a parlor trick thing. Like, we're going to roll dice and we'll make this waltz and then we'll play the waltz and like that. Um, Intro computer programmer person could write a program that could make more waltzes than you could listen to in your lifetime, right?
That's right.
And nobody cares about any of this because it's boring, right? Like, as soon as like these concepts, like to your friend that's running the event company, like everybody's showing up with these AI generated concepts. But if all those concepts are similar and the same, then over time, like, it doesn't really matter that everybody's using the AI thing, because invariably it's going to come back to like some person, interpreting that or coming up with some new idea or doing something totally different that wasn't expected, out of that model. And so I always feel like there's this like wave of abstraction that you're chasing when it comes to the technology, that as soon as something becomes easy, right? Like, let's say your example you were talking about earlier, where the AI will do the bidding for you and go out and find materials for you and stuff like that. As soon as that's a reality, that's great. That's an awesome reality. But now you want to do that plus something else,
That's
right?
right.
Like, you want to do that plus you want to do an extra thing. So now you're back to where, like, okay, now we're back in this painful space where like we're using all of this technology, but then we have to do this other part that's like not exactly working with that, or like now we have to do a bunch of extra work and like figure it out, and that's our niche or whatever. You know what I mean?
No, I think
So
that's
when people,
yeah,
yeah,
that's
yeah,
the growth. Look, I think it's
yeah,
idea. We're going to solve it. Between the two of those is painful, right? I mean,
yeah,
and I think every time we solve, it won't be enough. It'll never be enough. We'll want more.
mm-hmm,
We'll want more.
right,
Look, one of the reasons why I believe we are where we are now, it's kind of a philosophical point of view. I mean, a question I always ask somebody: do you think a butterfly or a caterpillar knows it'll become a butterfly?
mm-hmm, right,
And I
right,
always ask, like,
yeah,
my belief is why we're in AI today is because we're solving things so much faster than ever before, that the human brain is going to get to a point where it's met its Peter principle. It's maxed out, and we're
mm-hmm,
now at max efficiency of the brain. And why AI comes in such valuable at this point in our history is because we're going to kind of need it to solve the next layer of problems that are going to come so
yeah,
much bigger, so
yeah.
much faster.
Oh,
Now,
absolutely.
as
No, there's
long
a
as
really
yeah,
key, no, a really great example. Sorry to jump in, but a really great example. Have you seen Upcode's implementation that they did of AI stuff? It's great. So
yeah,
you can go to Upcodes and you can basically say, "Hey, Upcodes, summarize everything about spiral staircases in a residence in San Francisco for me, and get that back to me as like a little report, because I'm doing a project where we're going to do a spiral staircase, and I know vaguely the rules. It's been years since I've done one, right? Like, I could spend a bunch of time looking up the building code, but it's fairly complex. I need rise run, I need all this stuff, so that I can figure out how it's going to work. It just goes, it looks it all up. It gives you a nice written report with links that you can follow to those building code sections, so you can verify and make sure things are, or dig deeper into something if you need to. But then I can just look at that and be like, oh, this is great. It's almost like I've got an intern that I can task with extremely boring stuff, and they're going to be more than happy to do it over and over again to come back. That sort of application, or like people, software developer friends of mine using ChatGPT to do like boilerplate code stuff, where it's like, hey, ChatGPT, write me up a basic function for this thing that I need, right? And then I'm going to look at it and make sure it's right and make sure it works with the larger picture of what I'm trying to pull off, and that sort of stuff. Yeah, it's very empowering,
well,
in a really interesting way.
interesting thought. Now, put these together. Put
Yeah.
code up, right? Get the code software that does code. At the same time,
Mm-hmm.
we have design software. Imagine those two marrying and
Oh yeah.
getting to a point where it does its own design and
Mm-hmm.
a permit checks it.
Well, and this is the thing where, again, just coming back full circle back to Revit,
Yeah,
um, where like 20 years ago, I was making Revit families that had invisible solids in them that were clearances for things, to where
that's
like when I ran a collision detection, it would know like, oh, this door swing doesn't work, right? Because you don't have 5 feet past that door like you thought you did, right? Like that
Right.
kind of stuff. But I had designed that in. And back to my example of talking about the folding the aluminum, right? Like it was never built like the software really, when you get down to it, Revit, while it can be fantastic, it's a over 25-year-old desktop app now, right? Like it just wasn't like it's brilliant. Like it was pretty brilliant out of the gate, but it's just not able to do some of these things that we want to do now. And even though people were building things like I was, like to do these clearances in there, there's no such like code object, clearance object inside of Revit, right? No reason that there couldn't be, but there isn't, right? So, we're not able to build in like building code awareness into Revit manually, right?
Right.
And so therefore, like we can't, it's difficult to use Revit as a platform where you would be able to integrate it with something like Upcodes, and have it do that whole thing end to end for you, right? Possibly new system built with that sort of thing in mind could do something along those lines.
Interesting
So
idea, right? Like the problem is they're
yeah.
holding on to their old code. It's kind of the blockbuster, Netflix thing. Hey, we like
Mhm.
this way of doing it. We're not gonna move over to the new idea, and then boom. It'd be interesting to see where they
Yeah.
end up. Are they willing to, are they going to keep trying to band-aid an old code, or are they going to progress on to a new space where you'll be able to
Yeah.
pull both, the old functionality and new code, adapt, all the stuff that we're going to need to do to really to move in that next spot. Jeffrey, I
Yeah.
love you have this wealth of, I mean, just the way you think about the industry, the way you look at it. I'm always looking for, where do you see the industry in 25 years? Where are you seeing
Mhm.
the, what's getting you excited right now with, I know you're working on a couple of different companies right now. So talk
Yep.
to me a little about some of that stuff, the fabrication
Mhm.
stuff you're doing. Let's talk a little bit
Yep.
about that.
Yeah. So right now we got three things going. One of them is because we can, BWC Architects. That's our core business that we've had going for 20 over 20 years now, or almost 20 years. Sorry, we're coming up close to 20 years. And that's the design build architecture firm, primarily renovation work, where we heavily utilize Revit and digital fabrication in house to be able to make stuff. So we're kind of a typical boutique small architecture firm, except we physically deliver parts of the project using a lot of automation to be able to make that cost effective, right? So you can, so we're able to build really fancy stuff for the same price that other people are building normal stuff because we have robots making some of the parts, right? And we would get hired over time to make things for other firms, right? Like where a firm would bring us on as a collaborator or as like a fabrication consultant to help rationalize stuff out and that sort of thing. Or we just get hired to help make stuff. Like we have a friend's company that has a startup. They need 500 of these wood widgets. We have a workshop, we have people, so we'll help produce that sort of stuff. So we spun that off into its own brand that we're calling Secret Weapon Workshop. That's its own thing. And then the third thing is just recently, about 5-6 years ago, started a furniture company with some people. It was VC backed. They're still going at it. But about a year and a half ago, me and my wife, who was the other co-founder, left to go back to do our own thing. And we're starting to work on some product stuff that we're going to be launching hopefully later this year. As well, in that same space, kind of furniture and, stuff. What we wanted to do was kind of more niche and weird, to be honest, than what the furniture startup was doing. But all of it is kind of the same route of like model centric design, CNC production, and leveraging all of that as much as possible, to make great stuff. But to come back around to like where I see things going, you were saying like in 20 years or something like that.
Yeah.
I don't know. It's a really interesting pivotal time in the industry because there's a lot of stuff. About 10 years ago, I gave a talk on where I thought things were going, right? And 10 years later, I look back at that talk and I'm like, okay, some of it was true, some of it didn't happen at all because nobody did it. Like there's things I assumed Autodesk was going to do that they didn't do. You know what I mean? There's things that people are starting to look at doing now, but it's still very startup-y, and I don't know if it's really going to work. Like for example, Autodesk now is talking up a lot about how Forma is going to be their future platform. And it's going to be web based, it's going to be smart, it's going to be all this kind of stuff, right? But and this is a little cynical of me, I remember other projects that they announced, like Quantum, and before that, other things where it was this going to be the same thing. So for the last 10 years, or Autodesk has been announcing these platforms that they're going to build to eventually replace Revit, and we don't really have anything, right? And now they have Forma, but what they really did was take Spacemaker, which was another startup that they bought, and just put Forma label on it, right? And saying, okay, we're eventually going to build this out to replace Revit, right? But so far, everything I've seen, I'm like, okay, this looks cool. But again, I primarily do renovative work. I'm not doing early conceptual stuff. I'm not doing campus buildings. I'm not doing any of this kind of stuff. There's no here for me yet. Also, I worry because I remember seeing Autodesk with Forge, where they took a bunch of different API, web-based APIs that they developed. Some they developed in-house. Some are from companies that they bought. Some are from acquisitions, you know what I mean? That sort of thing. And then they kind of rolled it all up into one giant ball and put Forge on it as a new marketing logo. Now it's called like Autodesk Platform Services. They changed the name like a year or two ago. Point is that like they made up this story around it, right? That it was one platform and that was integrated and all this kind of stuff. But when you get deeper into Forge, it wasn't one platform. It wasn't very integrated. It was lots of different like separate platforms, and you had to do a ton of work to make anything talk to itself. And some of the stuff was like really expensive to run because the way that they were charging for computation or space was like not really tenable. And then at the end of the day, though, Autodesk itself, because they're such a huge company, and I mean, I used to work there for a while, and they're really smart, great people. But at any large company, they can start kind of believing their own story too much, right? So I remember having conversations with people at Autodesk that were at a fairly high level that would be like, where I'd be like, hey, I'm trying to solve these problems. And they'd be like, well, Forge can solve those problems. And I'm like, no, actually, it can't. And they'd be like, well, it can. That's our story. And I'm like, yeah, that doesn't actually, like, the story you've been telling yourself around what Forge isn't what's really actually there. You know what I mean? And so I worry about the same thing with Forma, where it's like, you talk to people that aren't in the trenches at Autodesk, or you talk to people in the industry, and they're like, well, Forma is going to be the platform that replaces Revit in the future. And I'm like, I don't see it yet. The other problem that I go back and forth on lately is, so when I was doing modelnumber.com is the furniture startup, I was the CTO and I was doing software development around e-commerce to help, sell the furniture and have customizable options in the furniture and all this kind of stuff. After doing a bunch of web development stuff, I'm like, I don't know if web apps are actually the future for our construction industry, right? Like, web development in general, at least with current technology, is atrocious, right? Like just in terms of the code and
Well,
what you
just
have to do,
yeah,
it's just very fragile
yeah.
and really problematic in a lot of ways on the development side. So, and I'm seeing different startups like Snaptrude, and there's a few that are in stealth that I'm working with that are working on things as well, where they're building these web-based apps for the construction industry to try to solve some of these problems. And some of them are doing some really interesting things that are really exciting, but at the same time, I'm watching all of them kind of struggle with the fact that they're trying to make a web app, right? Where I'm like, if this was just like a desktop app that was written using like modern, code from like, I don't know, like Unreal Engine or some, off the shelf thing that already runs really well, it just seems like you'd be so much further ahead than where you are. But because you're trying to make it run in a browser, it's like, and then also like, when you look at the industry, like Onshape, do you know Onshape? It's
I haven't worked with it. No.
yeah, no, it's
Interesting.
it's a mechanical engineering CAD tool that
Okay.
was made by some of the original founders of SolidWorks. Basically,
Huh.
we're like, we're going to make SolidWorks, but we're going to make it run in a browser, right? And so it's SolidWorks in a browser. Basically, it's brilliant. Like, it's amazing. It's an incredible tool for CAD. It Nobody uses it. Like, I mean, people use it, but like, it did not catch on. Like, the industry, when you go to manufacturing and the mechanical engineering world, it's still like 70% SolidWorks,
But yeah,
you
they're all
know.
solid works.
So
Yeah.
again, I'm kind of like, okay, yeah, it's all SolidWorks. So I'm like, all right, like, even though Onshape can replace most of what SolidWorks does, just because it runs in a browser isn't enough of a differentiator. You know what I mean? To
Yeah.
make it to where it's going to displace SolidWorks for whatever reason, right? And so I'm kind of like, all right, like, is that also going to happen on the construction industry side, where somebody might come out like Snaptrude. Let's say Snaptrude completes everything it wants to do, and you can do end-to-end projects in Snaptrude completely through the browser, or Qtronic, or any of these other like early startups that are doing new BIM stuff that just runs through a web browser. I'm kind of like, is that really going to be where things wind up going, or is some like, desktop app going to come along and disrupt it all? Because like all these firms use Rhino. Rhino's used a ton because it's cheap, it's really easy to run. It's really easy to just throw on your any computer to run it. It's essentially AutoCAD, like it's command line driven modeling, drafting. Like it's really straightforward. It's really popular. People love Rhino, right? Like use it a lot. And meanwhile, me being a heavy duty Revit guy, I'm always like just kind of flabbergasted that people are working that way. Where I'm like, what do you mean you're manually drafting everything? Like, you're doing like you're running make 2D commands and then drawing over the top of it to make your document set. I'm like, why are you doing that? But people do, and it's effective, and people are doing great work that way, even though I think it might be not the most efficient way. You see what I'm saying? I'm just saying that, like,
it's where they've always done
like,
it. They're changing is the hardest part. It's holding on to the old way of doing it. Like the problem is you get stuck that way. It becomes easy. I'm going to change tomorrow. I'll do it next time. I'm going to take a month. I'll learn this and I'll figure it out. And they never do. They're stuck in today's work. It's the classic issue. That's ultimately going to be what drives the change. Is that, look, in order you're going to be competing against folks that are, I keep saying this to everybody. Look, you want to be working on it now, because the folks that get this change now, the folks that are really moving forward and making those changes now, that learning curve, right? You don't want to be too behind, right? Right now you're one behind. You don't want to be too behind. Let's get keep moving that team forward. Now the problem is, guys like me, I'm 56 years old. I've changed. I had the little blue dot. I had the little green screen. I've changed so much in 56 years. I'm exhausted by change, and can't I just get to retirement without, and I think that's what happens is the leadership of companies are going, all right, I'm just going to get to retirement, and I'll leave let you guys figure that out after I'm gone. And that's always kind of the holdback. They've committed to the way of being, and they're just making revenue for today, but not realizing that, it's going to cost them, right? It's going to cost them. It's going to cost the longevity of the firm, not making those changes now and really going all in on, developing that future stuff. Jeffrey, I think we've gotten, look, every time we put this together, you and I, this conversation is so wonderful. I want to have you on more times and go through some more detailed stuff and continue to really pull us forward as an industry. Look, now more than ever, people are realizing the impact of our old ways of being. How do we start to really pull us forward with hope and desire, like going, hey, look, we got great ideas. We got people that are excited about changing the business. Let's pull, these young folks are coming in. I think more than ever now realizing, all right, I'm going to pull these archaic dinosaurs forward. Let's inspire them to continue to do so.
Yeah. And I think that is going to be one of the bigger changes when you ask, like, what does the 20-year work, window look like? I think one of the really big changes is just that a lot of the people our age and slightly younger that are coming into the primary decision makers at a lot of these firms do have a background that's, solid in terms of 3D modeling or solid in terms of technology, and are much more embracing of a lot of these kinds of new tools and new ways of working. And I see that could be a big shift in the industry happening over the next, 10, 20 years. That basically, as you get more senior leadership that's more comfortable with the digital tools and more comfortable working in, kind of more 3D sorts of model centric sorts of workflows, it might change the industry in some ways there.
Well, it certainly has to, for sure. I see a future where technology broadens, lessens the weight of the work, very similar, look at the difference between Uber and a taxi driver. I mean, a taxi driver used to have to know every street and used to have to, have all these rules. Today, you just have to know how to drive a car. You get in, you tell it what you want. I want to go from here to here. I mean, and you follow the prompt of the app. And I feel like technology will do that in the architectural world. We'll be able to describe what we want, really kind of start to articulate bigger and bolder ideas, and the weight of it will be held in technology. The technology will carry the weight for it. So I think at least from where I stand today, I see that, um, you know, it's not there yet. Look, I think there's a bunch of people. They're all, every time I interview another group of people that are working on a segment of it, right? They got one little piece, and then they'll join together, and then they'll move up. Um, but I certainly feel like the future will allow us to have a wider band of people that maybe weren't technically as adept as we had to be to get there. But I think they'll be as excited about creating new ideas. So I think the technology will certainly hold a lot of that weight.
Yeah, yeah, indeed.
Good. Listen. Hey, people want to get a hold of you, Jeff. Jeffrey, where do they? What's? Give me some numbers. Give me some address, some email address. Where can they get a hold of you so that look, they want to bring you on board to do some work for them? I mean, I know you're working with a lot of companies right now to help them become, go from design to build faster, right? Really helping them build software and design stuff to create materials.
Yeah. So the primary easiest way to reach me is through my email, which I'm really open about. If you just go to Jeffrey, Jeffrey at becausewecan.org, which is our old URL, or bwcarchitects.com, that just goes straight to me. I've really pulled back from social media in general. I am really active on LinkedIn. So if you just look up Jeffrey McGrew on LinkedIn, you'll totally see me and you can connect with me there. I'd love to have conversations over LinkedIn with people. And then Secret Weapon Workshop, since we started off as its new brand, its website is just secretweaponworkshop.com. And there's ways to contact me there as well. So, awesome. But I'm very good over email. I love emailing. So feel free to just email me out of the blue, and I'll totally, I might not respond right away because I'm really busy, but I will absolutely respond over time. So
Jeffrey, you are like a light in this business. I just cherish having you on here. It's been a joy all day to have you and go through the stuff. Thanks, brother, for being on.
Thanks for having me on.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, we'll have you on some more. Audience, as always, if you could take a second and like and subscribe. Look, last week we were down to, there was 40%. We were down to 40% of you guys listened all the way to the end of the podcast, but we're not subscribed. Right. I'm like, it was down from 42 from the week before, which is kind of surprising that you listened to the whole podcast, but you didn't like and subscribe. Well, do me a favor. Could you do that now? Take a second and just like and subscribe for me. It means the world to Joe and Connor, all the folks in the background that do all the work for us, and myself and Jeffrey. It means the world to us to have you on there. Just, it really helps us get better guests like Jeffrey on the podcast. So if you could do that now. And as always, we're so grateful for you listening.